3 in the morning on the 14th of February, and the wind off Sawyer Mountain was doing what it always does in a bad February, lying to you. It would drop for 30 seconds, just long enough to make you think the worst had passed, and then it would come back twice as hard, pressing against the glass of Booth 9 like something that wanted in. I had been working that stretch of highway for 6 years by then. Night shift, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, collecting tolls on a road that most people only drove when they had no better option. The pay was steady and the silence suited me, which tells you something about where I was in my life. My name is Denny Alcott. I am 53 years old. I own one good coat, and for 6 years the most honest thing in my possession was a small copper toll token I kept in the left pocket of that coat, against my hip, where my hand would find it without thinking. I had it pressed between my thumb and forefinger the moment I heard the knock. Not a car pulling up to the collection pad. Not tires on the rumble strip. A knock. On the side door of the booth, the one nobody ever used because nobody ever needed to. 3 knocks, deliberate and patient, like whoever was standing out there in a February blizzard had all the time in the world and trusted me to answer. I opened the door. She was standing in the snow in a dark blue wool coat, her hair pushed sideways by the wind, and she looked at me the way people look at someone they have been trying to find for a long time. Not desperate, relieved. I did not know her name yet. I did not know what she was carrying, or how far back it went, or what it had cost her to carry it. I did not know that she had been driving out to this booth every Friday night for 7 months, or why or what she was hoping to find in a man who handed change through a scratched plexiglass window for a living. I thought I understood what was happening between us. I thought I had it figured out. I had it wrong from the very beginning. My name is Denny Alcott, and for 6 years I had been the man nobody passed without forgetting. That is not self-pity. That is just the arithmetic of the job. You hand a driver their change, they pull forward, and inside of 4 seconds they are thinking about whatever is waiting for them at the end of the mountain. You are already gone from their mind before your window is fully closed. I did not blame them for it. I had done the same thing 100 times in my own life, driven past people who were standing right there and never once wondered what they went home to. Sawyer Mountain Highway runs 41 miles through the Cascade foothills, 2 lanes most of the way, and the old toll corridor sits at the high point where the tree line thins out, and the wind has nothing to push against except you. In winter, the temperature at that elevation drops 15 degrees below what it is in town, sometimes more. The booth heater was a wall unit the size of a bread box, and it rattled like a coffee can full of pennies when the cold really set in. I had reported it 3 times. By the 3rd report, I had stopped expecting anyone to come fix it and started wearing my thermals under my uniform shirt instead. I had been working that shift since March of 2019, 6 weeks after Carol died. People told me I went back too soon. My brother-in-law Ray said it plainly at the repast. "Denny, you are burying yourself in that booth." He meant it as a warning. I heard it as a description of something I was already choosing, quietly and on purpose. The booth was the only place where the silence had a reason. It was not the silence of a house that used to hold a woman's voice and now held only the sound of the refrigerator and your own footsteps. It was the silence of a job, and a job's silence is a clean thing you can live inside without it eating you. Carol had been 44 years old, a nurse. She knew how to fix things with whatever was nearby, a piece of tape, a folded cloth, her own calm hands. She was the most competent person I had ever been close to, and I do not mean that as a small compliment. I mean it the way you mean it when you realize the competence was a kind of love, that her whole way of moving through the world was an act of care she was performing all the time, for everyone in reach. And I had been lucky enough to live inside the radius of it for 22 years. She left me one thing that I kept on my person every single shift. It is a copper toll token, not current issue. Old pre-decimal, the kind the state used on these mountain roads in the 1970s before they switched to coins. Slightly smaller than a dime, with a raised outline of a pine tree on one face and the denomination on the other. 1 toll. She had found it in her grandmother's junk drawer and kept it for years in the little ceramic dish on our kitchen counter, where we both dropped our pocket change at the end of the day. The night she died in the hospital, she pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She had been a nurse long enough to know what she was doing, and she did it the way she did everything, with intention and without waste. I had carried it every night since. Right front pocket, loose so my thumb could find it without looking. The edge had worn smooth in one spot from the habit. That token was the center of everything that came after. I just did not know it yet. The first Friday she came, it was raining. Not the dramatic kind of rain that announces itself. The slow, gray, October kind that starts sometime around dusk and just stays, settling into the pavement and the pine needles and the collar of your jacket until everything smells like wet bark and cold metal. The kind of rain that makes the mountain highway feel like the loneliest road on the continent. I had been working the booth for 6 years by then, and I knew every regular on that stretch the way you know a face without knowing the name behind it. The retired couple in the cream-colored Buick who always came through at 8 on Tuesday nights, heading back from wherever they spent their weekdays. The kid in the dented pickup who ran the same route every Thursday just before midnight. Always exact change ready and all ready in his palm before he pulled up to the window, like he had been practicing. A few truckers who nodded the same nod every time. The kind of nod that means I see you and that is all either of us needs. I had never seen the dark blue sedan before. She pulled up at 11:14, which I noted without thinking about it the way you note things on a slow shift, not because they matter, but because your brain is looking for something to hold. The car was clean despite the rain. A Honda Accord, maybe 4 or 5 years old, no bumper stickers, no parking permits dangling from the mirror, nothing in the back window, the kind of car that told you nothing on purpose. She rolled the window down before she even stopped fully, which is a thing people do when they are comfortable with the transaction, when toll booths are not a thing they think about but simply a pause in a longer motion. She had the $2 already in her hand. I took it. I gave her the ticket stub for the corridor log. Standard. She said, "Thank you." Most people do not say that. They say nothing, or they say have a good one, or they say keep the change when there is no change to keep. She said thank you the way you say it when you mean the specific thing and not the general gesture, and I could not have told you in that moment why that landed differently, only that it did, somewhere in the space between my sternum and my spine. I said, "Drive safe. The mountain gets slick past the second turn." She looked at me then. Not for long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. She had dark eyes and a stillness to her face that was not unfriendly, but was not performing friendliness either, and she said, "I know this road." Then she drove. I watched the taillights of the Accord disappear around the curve toward the second elevation marker, and I stood there with my hand still on the edge of the window ledge, and the rain coming down, and the booth humming its low electrical hum, and I thought, I know this road. What a thing to say. Not, I'll be careful. Not, I've driven it before. I know this road. Like the road was something you could have a relationship with. My thumb found the token in my right front pocket without my telling it to. I ran the worn edge back and forth across the pad of my thumb, and I stood there a few seconds longer than I needed to, looking at where the taillights had been. And then I pulled the window shut and sat back down on my stool and picked up my thermos. The next car came through at 11:31, a minivan. The driver was asleep on his feet, practically, and I reminded him about the turnoff for the rest area at mile marker 44. I did not think about the dark blue Accord again that night, but I thought about those 3 words for a long time after. She came back the following Friday. I did not know she was going to. There was no reason to expect it. The mountain corridor got all kinds of regulars, commuters, and long-haul truckers and the handful of people who drove the scenic route out of habit or stubbornness. But a single woman in a dark blue sedan on a Friday night did not automatically constitute a pattern. I told myself that. I believed it, more or less, right up until I heard the engine note I had already somehow cataloged, and I looked up from the crossword I was failing at, and there she was. She paid with exact change again. Correct coins, no fumbling, the same quiet efficiency as before. I gave her the same nod. She pulled away. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. By the third Friday, I had stopped pretending I was not watching for her. I am not sure how to explain what those visits meant without making them sound like something they were not. And maybe that is the trouble with trying to describe a thing that lived almost entirely in the silences between two people who barely spoke. She would roll down the window. I would say the toll, $3.50, and she would place the coins in the tray with a kind of quiet precision that I had come to find, without any logic to support it, deeply calming. She would ask something small, the kind of question a person asks when they want the briefest, honest contact with another human being, and nothing more. Once it was whether the deer were bad this time of year up on the ridge. Once it was just cold night, and I said, cold night. And that was the entire exchange. Then the window would go up and the taillights would find their place in the dark, and I would be alone again with the hum of the fluorescent strip above my head, and the distant murmur of the radio I kept turned low. November came. The trees along the upper stretch went bare, and the highway took on that particular quality it gets in late autumn, a kind of stripped, honest bleakness, the way a room looks when the furniture has been moved out and you can see for the first time how the light really falls. I started bringing better coffee. I did not examine why. I started making sure the booth window glass was clean on the inside by 10:30, which was not something I had ever prioritized before. Small adjustments. The kind a person makes when they are, on some level, expecting company, even if the company is 3 minutes long and conducted through 4 inches of glass. December. She brought a thermos of her own, and I noticed it sitting in the cup holder when she rolled the window down, the steam just barely visible in the cold coming off the glass. I nearly said something about it and then didn't. That was how most things went between us. The almost said thing, and then the silence where it had nearly been. January was hard. 2 Fridays in a row she came through just before midnight instead of just after 11. And I spent both of those weeks convincing myself she had changed her schedule, that she had stopped coming at 11 altogether, and I was not going to pretend even now that I handled that gracefully. I sat on my stool and I watched the road and I turned the copper token over in my fingers until the pad of my thumb was warm from the friction. When the headlights finally came, I did not move. I stayed very still, the way you stay still when you do not want yourself to know how relieved you are. That was when I understood it. The understanding settled on me the way cold settles on a long road, gradually from every direction at once. I had been watching the clock all week, every week, since October. 7 months of Fridays, and I had been waiting for all of them. I put the token back in my pocket, and I did not think about what that meant. Or I tried not to. But the booth is a small room, and a small room does not give a man many places to hide from himself. The last week of February began the way most weeks begin on Sawyer Mountain Highway, quietly with the kind of cold that has stopped being dramatic and settled into something permanent. The pines on the far ridge held their snow without complaint. The road held its silence the same way. My supervisor, Gil Pressman, came up the mountain on a Tuesday morning, just as my shift was ending. He was driving the state's white pickup with the orange stripe, and he pulled past the booth and sat in the lot for a moment before he got out. I noticed that. Gil was not a man who sat in parking lots. Gil was a man who walked through doors already talking. He had another man with him, younger, wearing a jacket with a county seal embroidered on the chest. They stood beside the truck and spoke with their shoulders angled toward each other and away from me. I was logging my final transaction counts on the clipboard, the same form I had filled out 6 nights a week for 6 years, and I was not trying to hear them. The booth window was cracked 2 inches because I always cracked it 2 inches at the end of a shift to let the stale heat out. I heard Gil say automated. I heard him say corridor assessment. I heard him say the old infrastructure on the mountain stretch is going to be a liability question before next winter gets here. The younger man said something about a timeline. Gil said within the year, most likely spring to late autumn depending on the budget cycle. Then he said the phrase demolition and remediation, which is the kind of phrase that sounds like paperwork until you realize it is describing the place where you have spent the last 6 years of your life. I set the clipboard down on the shelf beside the radio. The booth is roughly the size of a generous closet. The walls are painted a green that was probably practical once and is now simply the color of time. There is a shelf, a stool, a space heater with a coil that glows orange when it works and red when it is thinking about stopping. There is a small printed photograph of Carol taped to the inside of the door, the one from the camping trip we took the summer before she got sick. She is laughing at something off to the left of the frame. I never knew what. I asked her once and she said she could not remember, which I always thought was the most Carol answer she could have given me. I looked at that photograph. Within the year, spring to late autumn, budget cycle. I did the arithmetic the way you do arithmetic when you do not want the answer but cannot stop your mind from producing it. Fridays left. Not calendar Fridays, not work days, not shifts on the general rotation. The specific Fridays that mattered. 11 o'clock, southbound, dark blue sedan. The number I arrived at was somewhere between 20 and 40, depending on variables I had no control over. It was not a number that felt like enough. It was not even close to a number that felt like enough, though I could not have told you. Standing there with my clipboard in a green booth on the side of a mountain at 6 in the morning, what enough would have looked like. Gil knocked on the door and came in and shook my hand and talked about the state's modernization plan and the dignity of a long service record and the pension adjustment I could expect. He was decent about it. Gil was always decent. I thanked him. I meant it. I drove home in the gray morning light, and I counted the Fridays again, and I got the same number. And I turned the copper token over in my pocket all the way down the mountain. February came in the way February always comes on Sawyer Mountain. Not slowly, not with any warning you could actually use, but all at once, like something that had been waiting just past the tree line and finally decided it had been patient long enough. The forecast that week said possible flurries. I had worked enough winters on that mountain to know what possible flurries meant when the temperature dropped below 18 and the wind came off the ridge from the northwest. It meant you kept your thermos full and your boots laced, and you did not make any promises to anyone about what time you would be home. By 9 that Friday night, the snow was coming down in sheets. Not falling exactly, moving sideways, finding every gap in the booth frame, dusting the ledge of the transaction window with a thin line of white that I kept wiping away with the side of my hand. Traffic had slowed to almost nothing. A salt truck came through around 9:30, the driver giving me a two-finger wave as he passed, and after that the road was mine. I told myself she would not come. It was a reasonable thing to tell myself. The interstate bypass was 20 minutes south and completely clear, and any sensible person driving anywhere near Sawyer Mountain that night would have taken it without a second thought. I told myself this, and I refilled my thermos, and I watched the clock move from 9:45 to 10, and then to 10:15. At 10:42, the headlights came over the rise. I recognized the shape of them the way you recognize a voice before you hear the words. That particular width, that particular height off the road. The dark blue sedan moved carefully through the snow, slower than she usually drove, and it pulled into the lane and stopped at the window, and I slid the glass open. She had both hands on the wheel. The heat from inside her car pushed a small cloud of warmth out toward me, and then the wind took it. I said it was a bad night to be on the mountain. She said she knew. She said she had almost turned around twice. I processed her past the way I always did, the small mechanical transaction that had become something else entirely over 7 months. And I slid the window closed and I watched her pull forward. She did not go far. Maybe 40 yards past the booth, she stopped. I could see the red of her brake lights through the snow, and then the hazard lights came on, blinking orange against the white, and I picked up the radio handset before I had even finished thinking about it. Then her door opened. She stepped out into the snow wearing a dark coat and boots that were not built for this, and she pulled her collar up against the wind, and she walked back toward the booth. Not toward the window. Toward the door. I had had that door knocked on exactly twice in 6 years. Once by a state inspector checking compliance signage, and once by a teenager who had run out of gas and was too embarrassed to admit it to anyone else. I stood there for a moment with my hand not quite on the handle, feeling the knock come through the metal frame and into my palm. And I thought about all the Fridays stacked up behind me, and the number I had been counting, and the token sitting in my breast pocket against my chest. I opened the door. She was standing in the snow with her shoulders drawn up and her dark hair gone pale at the crown from the flakes. And she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in 7 months of careful transactions through glass. She looked, for the first time, uncertain. She said the road had closed behind her. She said her phone had one bar and no signal for calls. She said she was sorry to impose. I stepped back from the door. I said she was not imposing. She came in. The booth was not built for two people. It was built for one person who needed just enough room to reach the cash drawer, log the plate numbers in the ledger, and not go completely out of their mind between midnight and 6. There was my stool, a narrow shelf bolted to the back wall, a space heater the size of a shoebox running at full tilt, and a thermos of coffee I had poured at 11 and not yet touched. Vera stood just inside the door with the snow melting off her coat, and I could see her taking stock of the space the same way I had taken stock of her face. Carefully, without letting on what she was finding. I said she could have the stool. She said she was fine standing. I said the stool was the only thing in the room designed for comfort, and she might as well use it. She sat down. I poured half the thermos into the spare cup I kept clipped to the shelf, the one I had never once used in 6 years, and I handed it to her. She took it with both hands. For a while, we just listened to the storm. The wind off the mountain had a particular sound that night, low and continuous, not gusting but pressing, like something leaning its full weight against the booth walls and testing whether they would hold. The heater clicked. The radio on the shelf put out static in one wavering country station out of Burlington that kept fading and coming back. Neither of us touched the dial. She asked how long I had worked the mountain. I said 6 years on nights. I said before that I had done days on the valley route for 3 years. But nights up here suited me better now. She asked what had changed. I picked up the thermos and looked at it. I said my wife passed. I said the nights were easier after that because there was no one at home waiting for the shift to end. And if you had no one waiting, the dark hours were just hours. They did not feel like something being taken from you. Vera held her cup and did not say she was sorry. I was grateful for that. Sorry had lost its shape 6 years ago from being handled so many times. She said she understood something about that. About the way grief reorganized a day so that the hours you used to dread became the ones you could finally breathe in. I looked at her then. Really looked. The way I had not allowed myself to do through 7 months of glass in a 3-second transaction window. Her face held a quality I recognized because I had seen it in mirrors for 6 years. A stillness that was not peace. A stillness that came from having absorbed something enormous and deciding, privately, that you were simply going to keep moving anyway. I asked if she had lost someone too. She looked out at the white wall of snow beyond the window and was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer. She said not in the way I meant. She said it was more like she had lost an hour. One specific hour 9 years ago that had changed the direction of something in her, and she had never quite been able to find the seam where the change began and trace it back to where it should have gone. She said she had spent a long time looking for the beginning of that seam. I did not know what she meant, but I understood the feeling of being oriented around a single fixed point. The way a compass needle does not know anything about the world except which way is north and will swing back to it no matter how many times you turn the case around in your hand. Carol had been my north. The token in my breast pocket sat against my sternum, and I pressed my arm there once, just briefly. A habit so old I barely noticed I was doing it anymore. Vera noticed. Her eyes moved to my chest and then back to the window. She asked how Carol had died. I said a road like this one. A winter night. Not this stretch, but a stretch like it. An hour south. She had gone off the shoulder on black ice and the car had come to rest against an embankment. I said she had been alive when they found her and alive when they brought her in, and that she had pressed something into my palm in the hospital corridor and told me to hold on to it, and then she was gone. I did not say what the something was. Vera set down her cup on the shelf very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to be unreliable. Outside, the storm pressed on. The radio found its signal for a moment. One clean chord of something I did not recognize and then lost it again. Vera looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she looked at me. She said, 9 years ago, I was driving home from my mother's place in Corbin Falls. It was late October, a night a lot like this one, wet and cold and coming in fast. My tires went out from under me on a stretch of Route 11 about an hour south of here, and I went into the guardrail and then down a soft embankment. Not far, but far enough that I couldn't get the car back up on my own, and my phone had no signal, and the road was empty. I did not move. I sat in that car for maybe 20 minutes, she said. I had the hazards on. I didn't know what else to do. And then I saw headlights slow down above me and stop, and a woman got out. She didn't drive past and call it in from the next town. She didn't sit in her warm car and wait for a truck. She climbed down that embankment in the dark in her good coat, and she sat with me on the hood of my car in the cold. And she talked to me for 2 hours until the state trooper came. The wind pushed hard against the booth, and the whole structure gave its small, familiar shudder, the one I had stopped noticing years ago. She never told me her name, Vera said. I asked her twice. She just smiled and said names were for indoors. She had this way of saying things, like they were obvious and also entirely her own at the same time. My throat had gone tight in a way that made it difficult to swallow. She had dark hair, Vera said. She was wearing a coat that was too light for the weather. She kept saying she was fine whenever I apologized for her being cold, and I didn't believe her for a second, and I think she knew that. She told me about a drive she used to take with her husband up through the mountain corridor. She said the toll booth on the high stretch looked like something out of a storybook in the fog. She said her husband worked nights and that she sometimes drove that stretch just to wave at him through the glass, just so he'd know someone was thinking about him up there in the dark. I put both of my hands flat on my knees. That was Carol, I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. Vera's chin moved once, a tight nod. She pressed her lips together and held that for a moment before she spoke again. After the trooper came and got my car sorted, she just walked back up to her own vehicle and drove away. I never even got a proper look at her face in the light. I thought about her for years. I thought about what it means that a stranger just decides to stay. That she didn't calculate it or weigh it. She just climbed down a hill in a wet coat and stayed. She turned the cup in her hand slowly. I moved back to this part of the state 2 years ago for work, and I remembered what she had said about the mountain corridor, about the booth in the fog. I didn't know if it was this road or another one. I didn't know if I was looking for the right stretch. But on the first Friday, I drove it. I looked in through your window and I thought, this is the one. This feels like the one she meant. She stopped. I was looking for her, she said. I knew by the third or fourth Friday that you were the husband she had talked about, but I didn't know how to say it. I kept coming back thinking I'd find the right way. And then winter came in, and then more Fridays went by and I still hadn't found it. The storm filled the silence between us. I had been wrong about everything, every single Friday. The shape I had built in my mind of what those nights were, what she was, what we were to each other, I had built it on the wrong foundation entirely, and the truth underneath was not smaller. It was so much larger I couldn't find its edges. I reached into the front pocket of my vest. Not because I planned to. Not because I thought it through. My hand just went there the way a hand goes to a sore place without being told. Out of habit, out of years of reaching for the one thing that kept me anchored when the night got too long, and the booth got too small, and the mountain felt like it was pressing in from every side. The token was no bigger than a quarter. Copper, old enough that the face had gone smooth on one side from handling. It was not a coin you could spend anywhere. It was one of the original Sawyer Mountain toll tokens from before the state converted the corridor to electronic payment, 1981 issue, the kind the attendants used to hand back as change when a driver came through with nothing smaller than $1. Carol had found it in the drawer of the old booth office. She had pressed it into my palm 6 years ago on the night she died, at the hospital, the last time she was awake enough to know me. She had said, "Keep this in your pocket. Keep it where you can feel it so you know I'm still in there somewhere with you." I had carried it every shift since. Every single Friday night it had been sitting in that pocket while Vera was sitting in that car, and I had never once connected those two facts. I held it out in the flat of my palm between us. Vera went very still. She reached out one hand and touched the edge of it with 2 fingers, not picking it up, just touching it, like she was checking whether it was real. "She showed me one of those," she said quietly, "when we were sitting in my car waiting for the tow truck. She had it in her coat pocket. She said her husband worked this road. She said he collected things from the booth, old things the state was throwing away." She pulled her fingers back. "She talked about you for 2 hours." I could not speak. I closed my fingers back around the token. Vera looked at the window, at the white nothing pressing against the glass. When she turned back, her voice had changed, steadier, like she had decided something. "I need to tell you the rest of it," she said. "When I found out last spring that the state was planning to automate the mountain corridor, that they were going to demolish the old booths, all of them, including this one." She paused. "I work in transportation planning, regional infrastructure. I have for 14 years. Another pause. "I filed a heritage significance review on Booth 9, cited the original 1963 construction, the copper token system, the intact mechanical counter. I cited everything I could find. I've been renewing that filing every 90 days for almost 2 years now." The propane heater ticked in the corner. "You've been keeping the booth standing," I said. "I didn't know how to walk in here and tell you about Carol," she said, "but I knew I couldn't let them tear it down while I was still trying to find the words." I looked down at the token in my closed fist. Copper gone warm from being held. Carol had stopped on a dark road 9 years ago and sat in the cold with a stranger for 2 hours. And that stranger had spent 2 years driving out every Friday night and then 2 more years quietly holding back the machinery of the state with paperwork. All of it. Every Friday, every filing, every 90-day renewal, so that one man's last connection to his wife would still be standing when the truth finally had somewhere to land. I set the token on the small shelf above the coin drawer, right where it had lived every night for 6 years, and I did not say anything for a long time. Vera did not fill the silence. She had learned somewhere in those 7 months of Fridays that I needed silence the way other people need sound. The blizzard broke just before 5 in the morning. The highway crews came through and the road opened up by 7, and Vera drove back down the mountain in that dark blue sedan. And I watched the taillights disappear around the long curve, the same way I had watched them disappear every Friday for 7 months. Except this time I already knew she was coming back. The state's demolition order was formally withdrawn that April. The paperwork cited historical and cultural significance along the Sawyer Mountain corridor, language that Vera had spent 2 years carefully seeding into every renewal filing, every environmental impact addendum, every public comment period. She never put her name on any of it in a way that pointed back to her. She just kept planting the right words in the right documents and letting the bureaucracy do what bureaucracies eventually do when someone patient enough is steering them. The Sawyer Mountain Heritage Corridor designation came through in September. There was a small ceremony. The county supervisor shook my hand and said something about preserving the human scale of travel, and I nodded and thought about a woman pressing a copper token into a dying man's palm on a Tuesday night and telling him to hold on to it. I worked my last official shift on a Friday in October, almost exactly 1 year after Vera first pulled up to the window in the rain. The leaves were the same color they had been that first night. The air had the same cold edge to it. I collected the last few tolls of the evening, and then I sat in the booth with the light on, and I thought about Carol stopping on a dark road for a stranger. And I thought about what that one quiet act had sent, rippling out across 9 years without her ever knowing. Vera pulled up at 11, same as always. She didn't stop at the window this time. She parked, walked to the booth door, and knocked. I had it wrong from the very beginning, I told her when I opened it. She had not come every Friday looking for Carol. She came every Friday because Carol had already found her.